He didn't even look at her. Julian Croft adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit, his voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the victory party. Her, he smirked, his gaze fixed on his defeated rival. She was just a pawn, a useful piece on the board who played her part perfectly. The words struck Amara with the force of a physical blow. The world around her fell silent. Every shared secret, every late-night conversation in his private library. Was it all a lie? He had used her genius to destroy his enemy. But he never calculated what would happen next after seeing that first single tear escape her eye. He never realized that her tears would end up costing him everything. If this story has already touched your heart, please give it a like and subscribe for more. In a room where fortunes were traded like playing cards, the most valuable thing was a secret whispered on a napkin. The air in the onyx room was thick with the scent of money, a quiet, heavy perfume of old leather vintage scotch, and the kind of unshakable confidence that came from generations of wealth. Amara Washington moved through it like a ghost. Her simple tailored black dress a shadow amongst the glittering gowns and bespoke suits. Her movements were a study in professional grace, her hand steady as she refilled a glass of champagne, her expression a polite, impenetrable mask. She was invisible, and that was precisely the point. To them she was just part of the scenery, another silent servant in a world that wasn't hers. But beneath the calm exterior, her mind was a tempest. Every clink of ice, every casual laugh was a reminder of the mountain of debt her father had left behind. Not debts of irresponsibility, but debts of dignity, the crushing medical bills from an illness that had stolen his body, but never his mind. She felt a familiar, dull ache in her chest. The irony was almost suffocating. The man whose watch she had just avoided staring at could pay off her entire existence with what he likely considered pocket change. Her fingers brushed against the small, worn, leather-bound journal she always kept in her pocket. It was her only true inheritance. She could almost hear her father's voice, warm and full of passion, as he once showed her a fragile yellowed page under a magnifying lamp. "Look closer, Amara," he'd said. "Knowledge is the only inheritance that can't be taken from you. Remember that." Her eyes scanned the room and settled on the two men who were its center of gravity. Marcus Thorne, with his booming voice and perfectly coiffed silver hair, was the picture of old money. He held his glass like a scepter, his entitlement radiating from him in waves. And then there was Julian Croft. He was the opposite. Younger, sharper, with an unnerving stillness that seemed to suck the air out of his immediate vicinity. He was new money, a tech billionaire who had torn his way into their world with brutal efficiency, and they hated him for it. He didn't mingle. He watched his eyes like chips of cold grey flint, missing nothing. Amara overheard Thorne lean toward his companion, his voice a low sneer meant for Julian to hear. "Still chasing ghosts, Julian. Some of us collect history. You just collect assets." Julian gave no reaction, but the silence that followed was more cutting than any retort. The tension between them was a living thing, an animal coiled and ready to strike. And then the main event began. The auctioneer, a man with a voice as smooth and polished as the mahogany podium he stood behind, presented the final item of the night. And now, ladies and gentlemen, a piece of history thought lost to time. A recently discovered manuscript believed to have been penned by Sir Isaac Newton himself, detailing his early theories on alchemy. A collective, reverent hush fell over the room. An image of the manuscript with its spidery, archaic script filled the massive high-definition screen behind the podium. The bidding began a rapid-fire volley between the two titans Julian and Marcus. 2 million Marcus started dismissively. 2.5, Julian countered his voice, flat, emotionless. Amara was pouring a glass of water nearby when her eyes drifted to the screen. And then she froze. Her hand a moment ago, so steady, trembled almost imperceptibly. The world seemed to narrow the hum of the room, fading into a dull roar in her ears. It wasn't the handwriting, it wasn't the parchment, it was the ink, the specific way the iron gall ink had corroded along the edges of the paper fibers. It was wrong. It was a masterful imitation, but it was a 19th century technique, not a 17th century one. No. The thought screamed in her mind. It's wrong. The oxidation. Papa's notes. Page 87. It's a fake. 3 million, Marcus snapped his face, flushed with the thrill of the fight. 3.5, Julian replied, his voice unchanged. Amara's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't just an academic error. This was a multi-million-dollar lie about to be sold as truth. Her father had died in poverty, his genius known only to a handful of academics who had dismissed his later theories. His entire life was a testament to the pursuit of truth, no matter the cost. What was she doing, standing here serving water while his legacy was being mocked by a forgery on a screen? Her choice was a lightning strike. Stay silent. Stay safe. Keep her job. Or risk everything for the one thing her father had cherished above all else. She moved with a purpose that startled even herself. Her hand snatched a crisp white cocktail napkin from a tray. Her pen flew across its surface, her handwriting a desperate scrawl. The ink's corrosion is post-1820. It's a masterful fake. The bidding had reached 4 million. The auctioneer's voice was a drumbeat, marking her every step. 4 million going once. She walked, not looking at anyone, a ghost on a mission. She approached Julian's table from behind, as if to clear an empty glass. 4 million going twice. Her hand brushed past his chair, and the napkin fluttered from her fingers, landing on the small polished table beside his elbow. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. She kept walking her back, ramrod straight, every nerve in her body screaming. From across the room she watched. She saw his gaze flicker down to the napkin. He picked it up, his expression of bored indifference unchanging. He unfolded it. His eyes scanned the words. And for the first time all night, the mask of Julian Croft didn't just crack. It shattered. The auctioneer's voice rang out. Sold for $4 million to... But Julian's hand shot up, not with a paddle but with a sharp, cutting gesture that silenced the entire room. I'm out, he said, his voice. Quiet, yet it boomed in the sudden stillness. A wave of gasps and confused murmurs swept the room. Marcus Thorne stared, a triumphant, ugly smirk spreading across his face, believing he had finally broken his rival. But Julian wasn't looking at Marcus. He wasn't looking at the auctioneer, or the manuscript, or the millions of dollars he had just walked away from. His piercing grey eyes cut across the entire room, past the diamonds, and the silk, and the power, and locked onto the one person. No one else was watching the girl in the black dress. The chaos that followed Julian's withdrawal was a storm of whispers and frantic glances. For Amara, it was the perfect cover. Her shift was over. All she wanted was to melt back into the shadows, to escape the suffocating weight of the onyx room and the searing intensity of Julian Croft's gaze. She slipped through a service door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, her one thought to get to the employee exit and the anonymity of the late-night city streets. She was almost there when a figure materialized in front of her, blocking the narrow corridor. He was a mountain in a perfectly tailored black suit, an earpiece coiled discreetly in his ear. He was polite, but his presence was as unmovable as a granite wall. Miss Washington, he said, his voice a low, placid rumble. It wasn't a question. Mr. Croft would like a word. It wasn't a request either. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, washed over Amara. This was it. She was going to be fired or, worse, accused of trying to sabotage the auction. Every nightmare scenario she had suppressed now rushed to the forefront of her mind. There was no escape. Wordlessly she nodded, feeling like a prisoner being led to her sentencing. She followed him through a maze of sterile back corridors, the stark fluorescent lights, a harsh contrast to the gilded glamour she had just left. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft rhythmic click of her sensible shoes on the polished concrete floor. They didn't go to an office. They went to a private elevator, one that required a special keycard. It ascended silently, opening directly into the hotel's most exclusive space, the penthouse suite. The room was vast, a monument to modern minimalist wealth. It was impeccably designed, but held the cold, impersonal air of a place no one actually called home. Julian Croft was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, a silhouette against the glittering tapestry of the city skyline. He didn't turn when she entered. He let the silence stretch a deliberate, calculated move designed to unnerve her, to remind her who held all the power. Amara stood her ground, her hand instinctively finding the reassuring shape of her father's journal in her pocket. Finally he turned. His face was a blank canvas, impossible to read. There was no gratitude in his eyes, only a sharp, analytical intensity. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice cutting straight to the point. Amara took a steadying breath. She would not be intimidated. The ink, she said, her own voice, clearer and stronger than she expected. It was an iron gall ink, but the oxidation pattern, the way it corroded the paper fibers, wasn't consistent with 17th century chemistry. The technique used to age it was developed in the early 1800s. It was a brilliant forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. She delivered the information as a simple statement of fact, without embellishment or apology. He listened, his head tilted slightly, his gaze never leaving her face. He walked slowly toward a beautifully framed document hanging on the wall. And that one he challenged, pointing a single finger. A letter from King George III. Real or fake, Amara stepped closer, her eyes scanning the document. The parchment, the seal, the handwriting. It was a symphony of details she had spent a lifetime learning to read. After a moment she answered, "It's real. But it's not from the period his collectors believe it is. Based on the watermark in the parchment, this paper wasn't manufactured until after his death. This is likely a period-correct transcription, not an original signed by the king himself. Still valuable, but not for the reasons most people would think." A flicker of something surprised respect danced in Julian's cold eyes. He had expected a simple yes or no. He had not expected a nuanced, expert correction that subtly pointed out a flaw in his own prized collection. He turned and walked to a large glass desk. With a smooth motion, he wrote a number on a heavy piece of cardstock and slid it across the polished surface toward her. Amara's eyes fell upon it. It was an annual salary, a number so large it seemed unreal. It was enough to erase her father's debts, to buy a home to breathe for the first time in years. "I'm offering you a position," Julian stated, his voice returning to its flat, business-like tone. "You'll be my personal consultant for all art and historical acquisitions. You'll answer only to me." For a moment, Amara just stared at the number. This was the dream, the miracle she had prayed for. But then she looked up from the card, past the life-changing sum, and into the eyes of the man offering it. And she saw a predator. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed the card back across the desk. Her voice was quiet, but it held the unshakable weight of her father's legacy. "Why?" she asked. "Why me, Mr. Croft? I need to understand what your real angle is." Julian Croft was visibly taken aback. He was a king in his own kingdom, and no one ever questioned his decrees. A slow, thin smile touched his lips. It wasn't warm, but for the first time it seemed genuine. He was intrigued. "Because," he said, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping, "for the last 10 years, every single person who has entered this room has wanted something from me. My money, my influence, my approval. You are the first person who has offered me something I didn't even know I needed, the unvarnished truth, even when it put you at risk. In my world, Miss Washington, that is the rarest and therefore the most valuable commodity of all." She held his gaze, searching for the lie, the hidden clause. She found none. She found only a cold, calculating man who, for his own reasons, valued truth above all else. She took a deep breath. This was her one chance. "I have terms," she said. "I will not be party to anything illegal or unethical. My findings are to be respected. And I will require full access to your research databases and laboratory resources." He didn't hesitate. "Done," he said, the word sealing the deal. A strange calm settled over Amara. She had walked into the lion's den, and instead of being devoured, she had negotiated her own place within it. "All right, Mr. Croft," she said, extending a hand. "You have a consultant." As his cool, firm hand enveloped hers, she knew her life had just changed forever. But whether it was for better or for worse was a truth she had yet to discover. The first time Amara stepped into Julian Croft's private library, she forgot how to breathe. It wasn't a room. It was a sanctuary. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves, crafted from dark, fragrant cedarwood, held not just books, but history itself. The air was cool and still meticulously controlled to preserve the fragile lives of the treasures it housed. Ancient leather spines sat alongside sleek, climate-controlled display cases. It was a seamless blend of the ancient and the hypermodern, a temple dedicated to the preservation of stories. For the first time since accepting his offer, Amara didn't feel like an employee or an imposter. She felt like she had come home. Julian was already there, watching her, his face as unreadable as ever. He saw the genuine, unadulterated awe in her eyes, a look he had never seen on the faces of the jaded collectors who only ever asked, "What's it worth?" The first few days were a quiet, intense dance. He would lead her to a specific artifact, a Roman coin, a Renaissance map, a first edition novel, and simply say, "Tell me about it." He wasn't just testing her knowledge. He was testing her passion, her instinct. Each time she would deliver an analysis so insightful and detailed that it went far beyond what was written in his official provenance records. She didn't just see an object. She saw the hands that made it, the world it came from, the story it was trying to tell. One afternoon, he led her to a small, strange artifact on a pedestal. It was a misshapen piece of pottery lumpen and asymmetrical, with a crude, almost childlike drawing etched into its side. It looked completely out of place amongst the polished perfection of the rest of the collection. "Well, Miss Washington," Julian asked, a hint of challenge in his tone. "Your expert opinion," Amara leaned in, studying it for a long moment. She tilted her head, her expression one of deep professional concentration. Finally, she straightened up and looked him directly in the eye. "With all due respect, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice perfectly even. "It looks like something my cat coughed up." A beat of stunned silence hung in the air. Then Julian Croft did something Amara thought was a physical impossibility. He laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a sharp, sudden bark of genuine amusement that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. It was the first truly human sound she had ever heard him make. "My cat has better taste," he retorted, a rare smirk playing on his lips. "But that thing happens to be a pre-Columbian ceremonial vessel worth more than your apartment building." Amara didn't flinch. "That doesn't change the fact that it's ugly, sir." He laughed again, shaking his head slowly. The ice between them hadn't just cracked, it had shattered. From that moment on, he stopped calling her Miss Washington. The real shift happened a week later. They were examining a medieval manuscript, debating the authenticity of its signature. The official analysis was inconclusive, and Julian was prepared to dismiss it as a clever forgery. "Wait," Amara said, her voice soft. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching into her bag and pulling out the worn, leather-bound journal. It felt like she was revealing a part of her soul. "My father." He had a theory about this particular scribe. She opened the journal to a page filled with her father's elegant, precise handwriting and detailed drawings. "The official experts always focus on the ink and the parchment," she explained, her finger tracing a diagram of a letter G. "But my father believed the real key was in the muscle memory of the scribe. He called it a calligraphic fingerprint. See here the ligature, the connection between the G and the N. It has a very specific, almost imperceptible upward curve. It's a flourish no forger would think to replicate. My father catalogued it across 3 different authenticated documents. This manuscript has it. It's real." Julian leaned over the journal, his usual air of detached authority gone, replaced by a look of intense, focused fascination. He wasn't just looking at the notes. He was seeing the ghost of a brilliant mind at work, a lifetime of passion poured onto the pages. When he finally looked up, his gaze was different. The cold, analytical flint was gone, replaced by something warmer, something that looked almost like admiration. "Your father was a genius," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "The academic world was foolish to ignore him." Tears pricked Amara's eyes. To hear this man, this titan of industry, validate the work that had been her father's entire life. It was a gift more precious than any artifact in the room. It was the recognition her father, and by extension, she had always craved. That night they worked late, so engrossed in their research that they lost all track of time. The sun had set hours ago, and the library was now a warm, quiet cocoon against the outside world. "I'm starving," Julian announced, suddenly looking up from a manuscript. "And I can assure you my private chef went home hours ago." Before Amara could protest, he had ordered 2 large pepperoni pizzas to be delivered to the library. The scene that followed was one of the most surreal of Amara's life. There she was, sitting on a priceless Persian rug, surrounded by the written history of civilization, eating pizza out of a cardboard box with a billionaire. The wall of formality between them had completely dissolved. He told her about his own father, a ruthless businessman who saw art not as a source of beauty or history, but as another asset class, another way to demonstrate power. He never cared about the story behind the object, Julian confessed, his voice tinged with a bitterness that surprised her. Only the price it would fetch, and the rival he could beat to get it. The comment hung in the air, a dark premonition she couldn't yet understand. As she reached for another slice, Julian pointed with his own pizza toward a glass case a few feet away, where a fragile, ancient document lay illuminated. He looked at her with a completely straight face. "Just be careful," he said, his tone deadpan. "Don't get any pepperoni grease on the Magna Carta." Amara burst out laughing, a real, uninhibited laugh that filled the quiet space. In that moment, he wasn't Julian Croft, the cold-blooded billionaire, and she wasn't Amara Washington, the indebted employee. They were just two people sharing a meal, a passion, and an unexpected connection that felt as real and as precious as any artifact surrounding them. Leaving the library late that night, a dangerous feeling began to bloom in Amara's chest. It felt a lot like hope. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart for years were beginning to crumble. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't think she minded at all. The warmth of the library lingered for weeks, creating a comfortable rhythm between them. The dynamic had shifted from employer and consultant to something closer to intellectual sparring partners. Amara found herself anticipating their debates, her confidence growing with every artifact she analyzed, every theory she presented. She had started to believe that this world, once so impossibly distant, might actually have a place for her. Then, one morning, Julian summoned her to his office, the vast, sterile space on the top floor of his corporate headquarters. The easy camaraderie of the library was gone, replaced by the cold, sharp focus of the predator she had first met. On the large screen behind his desk was an image of a set of breathtakingly beautiful astronomical charts. Gerardus Mercator Julian, said his voice flat. 16th century. A complete set of his celestial projections. They're being sold at a private estate auction in 2 weeks. He paused, his grey eyes locking onto hers. Marcus Thorne has been trying to acquire this set for a decade. It's become his obsession. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. This isn't just an acquisition, Amara. This is a statement. We are not going to be outbid. We are not going to lose. A thrill of excitement shot through Amara, but it was followed by a faint, cold unease. This wasn't the passionate collector she had shared pizza with. This was the ruthless corporate raider the world knew and feared. Their preparation was like planning a military campaign. Amara spent days in the library's digital archive, poring over high-resolution scans of the Mercator charts. She used her father's meticulous methods, cross-referencing paper batches from the same period, analyzing the chemical signature of the ink, and identifying the cartographer's unique, almost imperceptible fingerprint in the linework. She confirmed not only their authenticity, but also their true historical significance, a value far beyond mere market price. She felt alive, her mind sharp, and engaged, her father's legacy flowing through her. Julian, meanwhile, did not study the charts. He studied his enemy. He compiled a dossier on Marcus Thorne's recent financial dealings, his psychological profile, and his bidding history from the last 20 auctions he had attended. Thorne is arrogant, Julian explained, pointing to a graph on his screen. He expects me to come in with brute force to throw money at the problem until it goes away. He sees me as a blunt instrument. He looked at Amara, a flicker of that cold fire in his eyes. We're not going to do that. We're going to let him think he's winning. We will let his ego become our greatest weapon. Amara was mesmerized. She was seeing the machinery of his mind at work, the same strategic brilliance that had built an empire, now laser-focused on this single goal. She felt like an integral part of his plan, a true partner in a game of immense stakes. The unease she had felt earlier was replaced by a sense of belonging, a feeling that they were an unstoppable team. The day of the estate auction was tense. The air was thick with the quiet hum of old money and unspoken rivalries. Marcus Thorne was there looking supremely confident, greeting acquaintances with a booming laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. He gave Julian a dismissive nod, his gaze sliding over Amara as if she were a piece of furniture. The bidding for the Mercator charts began. As Julian had planned, he let Thorne take the lead. He would place a bid, then let Thorne immediately surpass it. It was a masterful performance. He appeared hesitant, almost reluctant, drawing Thorn deeper and deeper into the fight, forcing him to bid against himself to push the price higher and higher on the fuel of his own pride. Amara watched her heart pounding, a silent participant in the high-stakes drama unfolding before her. Thorn, smelling blood, went for the kill. He placed a massive bid, a number that made several people in the room gasp. He sat back in his chair, a triumphant smirk on his face, certain he had finally crushed his rival. The auctioneer began his final call. Going once, going twice. At the last possible second, Julian calmly raised his paddle. He didn't shout. He didn't even look at Thorn. He stated a number, a figure so precise and calculated that it was just a fraction above what Thorn had clearly signaled was his absolute limit. The room fell silent. Thorn's triumphant smirk dissolved into a mask of stunned, crimson-faced fury. The hammer fell with a sharp crack that echoed in the stillness. "Sold," the auctioneer announced to Mr. Croft. The ride back in the limousine was filled with a humming electric energy. Amara was breathless with exhilaration. "We did it," she said, turning to him, her eyes shining. "Your strategy was perfect. He never saw it coming." Julian was smiling, but it was the thin, sharp-edged smile of a victor, not the warm, amused smirk she had grown fond of in the library. He stared out the window at the blurred city lights as he spoke, his voice cool and detached. It was he agreed. Thorn is predictable. He lets his ego do the bidding for him. In any game, Amara, you have to understand the true value of every piece on the board. You have to know when to sacrifice a pawn to trap a king. He paused, then his gaze shifted to her, his eyes holding an unnerving glint. And you have to know which piece is the one that delivers the checkmate. Today, your expertise was the checkmate. The words hit her with a strange, dissonant clang. Piece on the board. Pawn. Checkmate. The compliment meant to praise her felt chillingly impersonal. It framed her knowledge, her father's legacy, not as a shared passion, but as a tactical weapon in his personal war. A cold shiver traced its way down her spine. For a fleeting moment, she searched his face for the man who had laughed at her joke and confided in her over pizza. But all she could see was the ruthless billionaire, the king who moved his pieces with cold, calculating precision. She forced a smile, pushing the unsettling feeling away. It was just a metaphor, she told herself. A poor choice of words in the heat of the moment. But the crack had formed, and deep down in a place she wasn't yet ready to look, Amara knew that some things once broken could never be made truly whole again. The victory party was held in a place designed to make mortals feel small. It was the penthouse lounge of Julian's corporate headquarters, a glass box suspended in the night sky, with the city sprawled beneath it like a carpet of fallen stars. Amara stood by the panoramic window, nursing a glass of sparkling water, feeling like an exhibit in a museum. The elegant, understated silk dress she wore had been sent to her apartment that afternoon by a courier. A gift from Julian. At the time, she had felt a flutter of warmth. Now, under the cool, indifferent gaze of the city's elite, it felt like a costume, a uniform for the role of the billionaire's new pet project. Julian was in his element. He moved through the crowd with an easy, predatory grace, accepting congratulations, with a nod and a thin smile that never reached his eyes. When he introduced Amara, the words were always smooth, yet vaguely dismissive. "This is Amara Washington," he'd say. "My brilliant new consultant, an invaluable eye." The words were a compliment, but the tone made her feel like a newly acquired racehorse being paraded around the winner's circle. The unease that had started in the car was now a cold, heavy knot in her stomach. Then she saw him. Marcus Thorne had arrived. He cut a path through the party, like a ship through water, his face a tight, pale mask of controlled rage. He walked directly to Julian, ignoring the powerful people who tried to greet him. The ambient chatter of the party seemed to dim 100 quiet conversations tapering off as everyone sensed the impending collision. "Congratulations," Croft Thorne said, his voice low and laced with venom. "You bought yourself another trophy. But don't think for a second this is over." Julian took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes glittering with cold amusement over the rim of the glass. "Oh, I think it is Marcus," he replied, his voice dangerously soft. "This was never about the Mercator charts. You know that? This was about proving a point. Amara felt a sudden, urgent need to flee. This was a private war, and she was standing on the battlefield with no armor, but she was trapped, held in place by the invisible gravity of Julian's power." Thorne scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "What lesson that your new money can buy anything?" "No," Julian said, and the room seemed to fall completely silent around them. "The lesson is about discernment, about the difference between value and price. Tell me, Marcus, are you still upset about losing out on that Newton manuscript a few weeks ago? The one you were so certain was real. The one you would have mortgaged your grandfather's estate to acquire." A dark flush crept up Thorne's neck. He had walked into a trap and was only now realizing its jaws were closing around him. And then Julian did it. He delivered the killing blow. He didn't even look at Amara, but he gestured vaguely in her direction, a flick of his wrist that was more dismissive than any insult. "You see, I knew that manuscript was a forgery from the moment I saw the catalogue," he said, his voice a smooth, cruel purr, meant for the whole room to hear. "My only problem was how to prove it in a way that would be maximally humiliating for you. I just needed one final credible piece to complete the picture. A catalyst, if you will." He paused, letting the words hang in the air before he let his smirk widen. "Her," he said the single word, dripping with condescension. She was just a tool, a pawn who played her part perfectly. Her little discovery confirmed what I already knew, and made my withdrawal from the bid look like a stroke of genius, not a pre-planned execution. He finally turned his gaze on his rival, a look of pure, triumphant contempt on his face. "So thank you, Marcus. Thank you for falling for it so beautifully." The words didn't just strike Amara. They passed through her, turning everything inside to ice. The sound in the room dissolved into a distant, meaningless hum. The glittering city lights blurred into a smear of pain. Her mind flashed back to the library, his rare laughter, the warmth in his eyes when he spoke of her father's genius, the taste of pizza shared on the floor amidst the history of the world. It was all a lie. Every moment of connection, every shared confidence, every flicker of hope she had dared to feel, it had all been part of this cold, elaborate public execution. She wasn't his partner. She wasn't his intellectual equal. She was a tool he had picked up, used, and was now casually discarding in front of everyone. The shame was a hot, searing thing rising in her throat, choking her. She didn't make a sound. She didn't scream or sob. She simply stood there, her face a pale, frozen mask. But Julian, in his moment of triumph, finally made the mistake of glancing at her. He expected to see awe, or perhaps gratitude. Instead, he saw a single, silent tear escape from the corner of her eye and trace a slow, glistening path down her cheek. He saw her spirit, the brilliant, passionate light he had been so drawn to extinguish before his very eyes. And in that instant, the thrill of his victory turned to ash in his mouth. While Julian and Marcus were still locked in their tableau of toxic rivalry, Amara turned. She did it quietly, with a dignity that no one in that room could ever take from her. She walked through the crowd of powerful, important people who now parted for her, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She didn't look back. She walked out of the party, out of the glittering glass tower, her beautiful silk dress now feeling like a shroud. The cold night air hit her face, and it was only then that she allowed herself a single, ragged gasp. The hope she had so foolishly nurtured was gone, replaced by a devastating empty clarity. She hadn't been discovered. She had been used. Amara didn't take a taxi. She walked. She walked for miles through the cold, indifferent streets of the city, the beautiful silk dress clinging to her like a cold second skin. The sounds of the night, a distant siren, the rumble of a subway train beneath the pavement. The laughter spilling from a corner bar were a welcome shield, a wall of noise that kept her own thoughts at bay. But she couldn't outwalk the image burned into her mind, the cruel, triumphant smirk on Julian's face, as he dismissed her entire existence with a single word: porn. When she finally reached her small apartment building, the climb up the 4 flights of stairs felt like an ascent from a great depth. She fumbled with the key, her hands shaking, and stepped inside. The contrast was so stark, it made her gasp. Here there were no floor-to-ceiling windows or priceless artifacts. There was just the worn-out sofa she'd found on the curb, the faint, comforting smell of old books and ground coffee, and the familiar crack in the ceiling that she had stared at on so many sleepless nights. This was her world. It was small, it was a struggle, but it was real. The silk dress came off first. She didn't fold it. She let it pool on the floor, a shimmering puddle of a life that wasn't hers, a skin she was desperate to shed. She pulled on her own worn, soft sweatshirt and a pair of old sweatpants, the familiar fabric, a small comfort against her raw nerves. And then, in the safety of her solitude, the emotions she had held back with such force finally broke through. It started not with sadness, but with a white-hot, silent rage. A fury at Julian for his calculated cruelty, a fury at Marcus Thorne for his arrogant pride, a fury at the whole glittering, rotten world they inhabited, where people were just pieces to be moved around on a board. She paced the small room like a caged animal, her fists clenched, a scream trapped in her throat. When the anger subsided, it left a vacuum, and a deep, crushing wave of humiliation filled its place. She sank onto the sofa, pulling her knees to her chest. She had been so stupid, so naive. That rare smile, the shared jokes, the vulnerability he had shown her in the library, how could she have fallen for it? He had seen her desperation, her quiet yearning for recognition, and had played it like a master musician. Her gaze fell upon her father's journal, sitting on the small coffee table. She picked it up, her hands tracing the familiar, cracked leather. For a moment, she felt a profound sense of shame. "I'm sorry, Papa." She thought the words a silent prayer. "I let him use you. I let him turn your life's work into a party trick." She held the book, the physical weight of her father's legacy, and felt the tears she had refused to shed at the party finally begin to fall. But as she cried, a new thought, clear and sharp as a diamond, cut through the fog of her pain. Julian hadn't tarnished her father's knowledge. He couldn't. The truth her father had spent a lifetime uncovering was still the truth. It was immutable pure. Julian's sin wasn't in devaluing the knowledge. It was in revealing that he was incapable of truly understanding its worth. He had used a masterpiece to hammer a nail. The fault was with the hammer, not the masterpiece. The value of her father's legacy was not dependent on the approval of a man like Julian Croft, and her own value was not dependent on him either. The tears slowed. The shame receded, replaced by a cold, quiet resolve. She would not be a footnote in his story. She would not be the weeping girl in the pretty dress. She would be the curator of her father's memory, and that was a position no billionaire could grant her or take away. The last guest had long since departed. The cleaning crew had come and gone. Julian Croft was alone in his library, the silence of the room a heavy blanket. The newly acquired Mercator charts were displayed in a magnificent, climate-controlled case under a soft, perfect light. The centerpiece of his victory, the final definitive humiliation of Marcus Thorne. He stared at the ancient, elegant maps, but he felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, just a vast, echoing emptiness that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the room. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the clink of the heavy crystal against the bottle unnervingly loud in the stillness. He didn't want the victory. He wanted the chase, the fight, the intellectual dance. And the only person who had ever truly understood that dance, who had ever matched him, step for step, was gone. He kept replaying the scene at the party, but his memory skipped over Thorne's defeated face. It kept landing on Amara. On the way, the light had seemed to drain from her eyes. On the single silent tear that had traced a path down her cheek, he had seen women cry before tears of anger, tears of manipulation. But this was different. This was the sound of something pure breaking, and he had been the one to break it. He remembered her infectious, honest laugh when he had made the joke about the Magna Carta. He remembered the fierce, protective pride in her voice when she spoke of her father. He remembered the look of awe on her face when she first walked into this very room. He had taken all of that, all that light, all that passion, all that integrity, and he had twisted it into a weapon for a petty inherited war. He didn't even care about winning. He heard his own voice in his head dripping with condescension. Pawn. Tool. The words made him flinch. They sounded ugly, brutish. They sounded exactly like his own father. In that moment, staring at his reflection in the dark glass of the display case, Julian Croft had a horrifying realization. He had spent his entire life trying to be everything his father wasn't only to become a perfect, soulless copy. He had won his father's game, but he had lost himself in the process. The next morning, as the sun streamed through the window of her small apartment, Amara sat at her laptop. Her face was calm, her movements precise. She typed a short, formal email of resignation. There were no accusations, no emotional recriminations. It was a clean, professional severance, a quiet act of taking back her power. She hit send and felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Miles away in a silent library, filled with priceless, meaningless things, Julian saw the email notification appear on his tablet. He read the simple, polite words, and their finality hit him with the force of a physical blow. She had walked away from his world of glittering lies to find a truth of her own. And he left alone, in his silent, empty kingdom, finally understood that the most valuable thing he had ever possessed was not something he had bought, but something he had just irrevocably lost. And for the first time in his life, the great strategist had no plan, no countermove, and no idea how to get it back. For 3 weeks, the world that Julian Croft had built and commanded ceased to exist for him. He missed board meetings. He ignored increasingly frantic calls from his brokers in New York and London. The ceaseless, hungry pursuit of the next acquisition, the next victory had simply vanished, replaced by a new, singular obsession. His library, once a showroom of silent, conquered trophies, had been transformed into a global war room. But the enemy was no longer a rival. It was obscurity. He sat at the head of his massive oak table, not with his usual team of ruthless corporate lawyers, but with a collection of people who looked deeply uncomfortable in such opulent surroundings: a silver-haired, tweed-wearing dean from a prestigious university, a sharp-eyed young archivist who specialized in digital restoration, and a renowned, semi-retired academic historian. "Let me be perfectly clear," Julian said, his voice holding its usual intensity, but now aimed at a completely different target. "I want you to find everything ever written by Dr. Alistair Washington, every published paper, every footnote in another scholar's work, every half-finished manuscript, every letter he ever sent to a colleague. I want lecture notes, scribbles on napkins, anything. Consider your budget unlimited. Your resources are my resources. I don't want excuses. I want his entire intellectual life pieced back together." The dean shifted in his seat. "Mr. Croft, this is highly unorthodox. Dr. Washington was a respected, but somewhat fringe figure. Unearthing a lifetime of work could take years." "Then you have years," Julian replied without blinking. "Start today." What followed was a silent, global hunt fueled by Julian's immense wealth and relentless focus. An archivist dispatched to the dusty basement of a library at Oxford discovered a forgotten crate containing a series of letters between Dr. Washington and a long-dead British historian. In them, he had laid out a groundbreaking theory about trade routes that predated official records by a century, a theory he had been mocked for at the time. From his desk, Julian orchestrated late-night video calls across time zones. One was with an elderly retired professor in Heidelberg, Germany, a man who had been one of his father's closest friends. The professor was initially hostile, his voice full of suspicion for the billionaire intruding on his friend's memory. But as Julian spoke, not with the arrogance of a buyer, but with the genuine curiosity of a student, the old man's demeanor softened. He saw that Julian wasn't trying to acquire his friend's work. He was trying to understand it. The professor finally agreed to unseal 30 years of private scholarly correspondence. Back in the library, a separate tech team used advanced multispectral imaging to scan the pages of the worn leather journal Amara had left behind on her desk. Faded erased pencil marks and indentations on the paper revealed entire paragraphs of thought layers of her father's process that had been invisible to the naked eye. Julian didn't just delegate, he immersed himself. He stayed up all night reading the recovered papers, his brow furrowed in concentration, trying to follow the intricate threads of a brilliant mind. He who had only ever read contracts and market reports was now tracing the history of papermaking in the 15th century and learning about the chemical composition of medieval inks. He wasn't just uncovering a legacy, he was connecting with it. In the quiet solitude of his library, surrounded by the ghost of Alistair Washington, Julian Croft began to feel a different kind of fulfillment, not the fleeting, empty thrill of a victory, but the deep, resonant satisfaction of building something that mattered. After 2 months of relentless work, the hunt was over. The result was staggering. They had compiled a body of work that was more significant than anyone had imagined, enough to fill 3 large volumes and reshape the understanding of several key historical periods. But Julian knew that simply possessing the research wasn't enough. It had to be shared. Phase 2 began. He engaged a team of the world's best academic editors and a prestigious university press. His instructions were simple: prepare this for publication. I want these volumes in every major university library in the world. Spare no expense. Even that wasn't the end. He met with his legal and philanthropic teams. With the same ruthless efficiency he had once used to orchestrate corporate takeovers, he structured the legal framework for a new foundation. He endowed it with $100 million of his own fortune, an act that sent shockwaves through his financial advisors. The charter was meticulously drafted. The name on the documents was not his own. It was the Doctor, Alistair Washington Foundation for Historical Inquiry. Its primary mission, written into the charter by Julian himself, was to provide substantial, multi-year grants to brilliant but unconventional historians whose work was overlooked by the mainstream, a systemic solution for the very problem that had condemned Amara's father to a life of quiet obscurity. Finally, everything was in place. Julian called a press conference. The business world was buzzing with speculation. A new AI venture, a corporate merger. No one was prepared for what came next. He stepped up to the podium in a packed auditorium, the flash of cameras reflecting in his eyes. He looked different. The hard defensive edge was gone, replaced by a quiet, centered gravity. He set aside his prepared notes. For most of my life, he began, his voice calm and clear, I have been in the business of acquisition, of value. I thought I understood what those words meant. I was wrong. He didn't talk about technology or profits. He told a story. He spoke of genius and how it can be ignored. He spoke of truth and how it can be buried under the weight of conventional thinking. He spoke of a man named Dr. Alistair Washington. He unveiled the foundation. He held up the first beautifully bound volume of his published works. He made it unequivocally clear that his role was merely that of a facilitator, a conduit. The genius, the credit, the legacy, it all belonged to Dr. Washington. We live in a world that is quick to celebrate the loudest voice, the biggest success. He continued, his gaze sweeping over the sea of baffled reporters. But history teaches us that true progress often comes from the quietest rooms, from the minds of those who are willing to pursue a truth that no one else can yet see. He looked directly into the lens of the main news camera, as if he were trying to reach through it to speak to an audience of one. True genius should never be allowed to die in the shadows. Our job is to find that light and shine it where it is most deserved. This is not an act of charity, he finished, his voice resonating with a new profound conviction. This is an act of correction. The flashbulbs erupted in a frenzy. The reporters shouted questions, but Julian didn't see them. He stepped back from the podium, his work finally done. And in the blinding light, he thought only of Amara, wondering if his message, his long, difficult, and deeply inadequate apology, had finally reached her. Amara had found a new, quieter rhythm to her life. She'd taken a part-time job in the archives of a local university library, a place of peaceful, dusty silence that soothed the raw edges of her memory. She paid her bills. She read for pleasure. And in the evenings, with her father's journal open on her small kitchen table, she had begun her own modest research project, a quiet tribute to the man who had taught her everything. She was healing slowly, but the scar left by Julian Croft remained a tender, phantom ache that reminded her to never again be so foolish with her hope. She had seen the press conference. It was impossible to miss. The face of the man who had shattered her world was suddenly everywhere, not announcing a new piece of technology, but speaking her father's name with a reverence that made her stomach twist into knots. She watched it online, her heart a warring mess of emotions, shock, disbelief, a deep, cynical suspicion, and beneath it all a flicker of something she refused to name. Was this just another, grander manipulation? A way to launder his reputation, using her family's legacy as the currency? She had shut the laptop, unwilling to let that hope, however faint, take root again. Then, a week later, the invitation arrived. It was not a letter or an email from Julian. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, engraved with a simple, elegant crest she didn't recognize. Inside was a formal invitation to the inauguration ceremony and gala for the Dr. Alistair Washington Foundation for Historical Inquiry. The professional, almost impersonal distance of the invitation was the one thing that made her consider it. This wasn't a personal plea. It was a formal acknowledgement, an event that would happen with or without her. And she had to see it. She had to know. She chose her outfit with care, not the silk dress of his world, nor the uniform of her old job. She wore her own clothes, a simple dark green dress that she loved, professional and modest. She was attending not as his discovery or his victim, but as Dr. Washington's daughter. The foundation was not housed in a glittering, soulless tower of glass and steel. It was a beautifully restored brownstone on a quiet, tree-lined street, a building with its own history. The moment she stepped inside, Amara knew this was different. The air wasn't filled with the competitive hum of wealth, but with the quiet, excited buzz of genuine passion. The guests were not corporate titans and their wives. They were academics, historians, graduate students, and museum curators. They were her people. In the center of the main hall, where a grand sculpture might have stood in one of Julian's properties, was a single, large portrait. It was her father. An artist had painted it from the small, faded photograph she had once shown Julian in the library. He was captured perfectly, his kind eyes, the hint of a smile, the brilliant, restless intelligence that seemed to emanate from him. He looked happy. He looked seen. Beneath the portrait, protected in a glass case and illuminated by a soft, reverent light, was his original worn leather journal, opened to the page where he had first diagrammed his theory on calligraphic fingerprints. It was treated not as a curiosity, but as a founding document, a sacred text. Amara stood before it, her hand rising to her mouth. Her cynicism, the hard protective shell she had built around her heart, began to crumble. This wasn't a PR stunt. The detail, the care, the profound public respect, it was too personal, too precise. The pain of her own humiliation was still there, a ghost in the room, but it was now overshadowed by an overwhelming wave of gratitude for her father. He was finally getting the honor he had deserved his entire life. I read all of it. Julian's voice was quiet right behind her. She turned. He looked different. The sharp, arrogant edges had been worn down, replaced by a weariness in his eyes she had never seen before. He wasn't looking at her with the intensity of a predator or the pride of an owner. He was just looking at her, his expression open and vulnerable. He didn't begin with an apology. He began with her father. Every page, every note, he said, his gaze shifting to the portrait. I had my team translate the German correspondence. I read his arguments with the professor from Heidelberg. He should have won that debate. He was right. He looked back at her. I should have met him. The world should have known him. It was the perfect thing to say, the only thing that could have reached her. He was honoring her father, not trying to manage her feelings. Why she finally whispered the one question that remained. Why all of this, Julian? He took a deep breath, and for the first time he gave her the complete, unvarnished truth. Because that night at the party, I won. I beat Marcus. I proved my point, and I have never in my entire life felt more empty. I went back to the library, and all I could see was your face, the look in your eyes. He shook his head, a gesture of self-disgust. I had become my own father, a man who collected trophies but had no legacy, a man who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing. He gestured around the room at the people at her father's portrait. Your father's work, reading it, understanding it, it showed me what a real legacy looks like. It's not something you own. It's not something you win. It's something you build, something you give. He looked her straight in the eye, his own shining with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. This foundation isn't for me, Amara. And it isn't an apology I expect you to accept. It is a correction, an attempt to fix something that was broken, in the world and inside of me. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to an earnest plea. A legacy like this needs a guardian. Someone who understands its heart, not just its contents. The foundation needs a director, a president. He paused. It needs you, not as my consultant, not as my employee. He held her gaze. As my partner, my equal, to run this together. Amara looked from Julian's raw, vulnerable face to the warm, smiling eyes of her father in the portrait. The final wall around her heart dissolved. The tears that came this time were not the silent single tear of betrayal, but the quiet, cleansing tears of release. Of a peace she thought she would never feel again. Forgiveness would not be a single event, but a long, quiet process. Trust, if it were to ever exist again, would have to be rebuilt piece by painstaking piece over years. But this grand, selfless, deeply meaningful act of atonement, this was a foundation they could build upon. She didn't say yes. She didn't have to. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod, a tear tracing the same path down her cheek as the one from that terrible night. But this time, it felt like cleansing rain. "All right, Julian," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Let's get to work." It was not a romantic embrace that sealed their new beginning. It was a shared glance of profound understanding, two partners standing side by side, finally ready to build a true legacy together. Sometimes the loudest apology isn't a word whispered in secret, but an action taken in the light for the whole world to see. Amara and Julian's story reminds us that true atonement isn't about trying to erase a painful past, but about having the courage to build a better future from its ashes. How many brilliant minds like Amara's father have lived and died in the shadows, their genius overlooked by a world too busy to notice? And how often do we miss the chance to correct a wrong, simply because the cost to our own pride is too high? This story truly moved us, and we'd love to know how it made you feel. What part of this journey resonated with you the most? Was it Amara's quiet strength when she walked away from it all? Or was it Julian's grand act of creating the foundation? If you've ever felt that your own or a loved one's talents were overlooked, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. If this story made you think, please leave a like to let us know. And if you believe someone else needs to hear it, consider sharing it with them. Of course, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to join us for more emotional journeys that explore the deepest corners of the human heart. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the best way to heal our own mistakes is to build something beautiful in honor of what we broke.